My daughter brought me to a meeting with Arab investors, and in their language she said, "Don't mind my mother's shabby clothes, she's just a useless old woman." I smiled and answered calmly, in fluent Arabic, "Some people don't know how to value what they already have." My daughter went completely pale, but when the sheikh, who had been standing with his back to us, slowly turned around and realized who I was, he bent down, kissed the hem of my dress, and did something no one in that room could have predicted. "I'm honored you're here," he said. "Stay with me until the very end of my story and write in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story travels. My name is Evelyn, and at 63 I truly believed I had seen enough of life's cruelty to be ready for anything. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for the moment my own daughter, in a room full of influential Arab investors, said words that cut deeper than any knife ever could. "Don't look at my mother's rags, she's just a useless old woman." The sentence floated in the air like poison, spoken casually in Arabic, as if she were commenting on the weather. Zaid thought I didn't understand. She had always assumed her mother, the woman who had raised her alone for 25 years, was just an uneducated retiree who spent her days watching TV and fussing over a tiny garden. I stood there in the marble-floored conference room of the Meridian Tower, wearing my best navy dress, the one I had ironed carefully that morning, hoping to look presentable. My hands shook slightly as I held my old leather purse, the same one I had used for nearly 10 years. To anyone looking, I probably did seem exactly as Zaid had described, an older woman, out of place among sleek executives and wealthy investors. The meeting had been Zaid's idea. As the founder of what she proudly called a boutique consulting firm, she had been chasing these investors for months. The deal, she told me over dinner 3 weeks earlier, could secure her future: $20 million in funding for her tech consulting business and a gateway into the Middle Eastern market. "I want you there, Mom," she'd said. Her tone, however, sounded more like obligation than genuine desire. "It shows family values, these Arab businessmen like that." I agreed, of course, despite the tension between us, despite the years of subtle belittling and the embarrassment she felt about my simple life. She was still my daughter. When your child asks for support, you go. But as I listened to her dismiss me as worthless trash in Arabic, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just my heart. My heart had been shattered and patched up too many times before. This time it was deeper, the final thread of hope that one day Zaid might see me as something other than a burden. The lead investor, the man Zaid had introduced as Sheikh Hassan al-Rashid, stood facing the window, looking out over the city from the 40th floor. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with the easy authority of someone used to power. 2 other men stood beside him, their expensive suits and measured movements marking them as advisors. Zaid kept going with her presentation, her voice bright and confident. "As you can see from our projections," she said, "we're positioned to dominate the emerging markets you're targeting. Our algorithms process data in real time and deliver insights traditional firms simply can't." She gestured toward the screen, full of graphs and numbers she had spent weeks preparing. My daughter was undeniably brilliant. She had graduated summa cum laude from Stanford, built her company from scratch, spoken at conferences all over the world. But I had long since learned that brilliance is not the same as wisdom. One of the Sheikh's advisors leaned closer and murmured something in Arabic. I caught every word. "The old woman seems uneasy. Perhaps we should invite her to wait outside." That was when another part of me awoke, a part I thought I had buried decades ago, the woman who once walked into rooms where powerful men made decisions that shaped millions of lives, the woman who learned to speak not only with words, but with presence. I stepped forward and answered in clear, flawless Arabic, "Some people don't appreciate what they already have." The reaction was instant, like a shockwave. Zaid's face drained of color. Her jaw dropped. The advisors straightened, surprise breaking through their polished composure. But it was Sheikh Hassan's expression that made my heart race. He turned slowly, as if he were hearing a voice from the past. When his eyes met mine, I saw recognition spread across his features like sunrise. His face shifted from polite curiosity to something close to reverence. "It can't be," he whispered in Arabic. I gave him the same diplomatic smile I had once used in negotiations where a single wrong phrase could mean the difference between war and peace. "Hello, Hassan, you've grown." His hands trembled as he pressed them to his chest in a traditional gesture of respect. And then, to everyone's shock, this man, who controlled billions and had governments listening to him, dropped to one knee and kissed the hem of my navy dress. "My lady," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "the savior of my family." Zaid let out a strangled noise and staggered backward until she hit the conference table. Even her flawless makeup couldn't hide the confusion and horror on her face as she watched the useless old woman she'd dismissed being treated like royalty by the very man she had been so desperate to impress. I don't understand," she stammered, switching back to English. "Mom, what is going on? How do you know each other?" Sheikh Hassan rose smoothly, his gaze never leaving mine. When he spoke again, his English was accented but perfectly clear. "Your mother, Miss Morrison, is a legend," he said. "A woman who risked everything to save lives when the world chose to look away." The room fell completely silent. Only the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint noise of traffic far below reminded us that the world outside was still moving. I could feel my daughter's eyes drilling into me, silently demanding answers I wasn't sure I was ready to give. For 30 years, I had simply been mom to her, the woman who packed her lunches, went to parent-teacher conferences, and worked night shifts at the hospital so she could afford the education that built her career. "Hassan," I said softly, "that was a very long time ago." "Not long enough for our gratitude to fade," he replied. "Without you, I would not be standing here today. None of us would." One of his advisors, a man with graying temples and sharp, intelligent eyes, stepped closer. "Forgive me, sir, but are you saying this lady is Evelyn Morrison? The Evelyn Morrison who coordinated the Damascus evacuations?" The question hung in the air like a revelation about to detonate. I saw Zaid's confusion deepen, her gaze bouncing between the men and me as if she were suddenly trapped inside a puzzle where all the pieces had changed shape. I had spent decades hiding in plain sight, allowing the world to forget what I had once been capable of. But standing there, seeing the respect, no, the reverence, in these men's eyes, I remembered why I had fallen in love with diplomatic work in the first place. It had never been about the power or the prestige. It was about those rare moments when the right words, the right connection, or a single act of courage could change the course of someone's life. "Yes," I said simply, "I am Evelyn Morrison." The name felt strange on my tongue after so many years of being introduced only as Zaid's mom or Mrs. Morrison from apartment 12B. Yet at the same time, it felt like stepping back into my own skin. Sheikh Hassan pressed his hand over his heart again. "Then I must tell you," he said, "that my family has been searching for you for 25 years. The silence that followed his words felt like standing in the stillness at the eye of a hurricane. I could almost see Zaid's worldview coming apart, brick by brick. The woman she had just dismissed as a useless old woman was, apparently, someone these powerful men had been actively trying to find for over 2 decades. "Searching for me?" I asked, even though my diplomatic instincts had already supplied several likely reasons. In my old life, I had learned that gratitude in the Middle East was not a passing sentiment. It was a debt that could be carried through generations. Sheikh Hassan gestured subtly to his advisors, and they immediately stepped back to give him space. Even in this moment of personal revelation, he commanded absolute respect. "When I was 7 years old," he began, his voice threaded with memory. "My family was trapped in Damascus during the siege of 1992. My father was a minor diplomat, caught on the wrong side of a political uprising that threatened to tear the country apart. We had 48 hours to evacuate or face imprisonment, or worse. I remembered that time all too well. The calls in the middle of the night, the frantic coordination between embassies, the impossible decisions, who could be saved, who would have to be left behind. Those were the days when sleep was a luxury and every choice carried the weight of lives. The official channels failed us, Hassan continued. The American embassy had already evacuated non-essential personnel. The British were overwhelmed. We were told to wait, to hope for the best. And then a woman appeared at our door. I felt Zaid's stare burning into the side of my face, but I kept my attention on Hassan. Some stories have to be told all the way through before the questions are allowed to start. She spoke flawless Arabic, he said. She knew back routes through the city that even locals had forgotten. She had a network of contacts that seemed impossible for one person to maintain. Within 36 hours, she had us on a plane to safety, along with 14 other families who had already been written off as lost. He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his chest, where I could see the faint outline of a pendant beneath his shirt. My father spent the rest of his life trying to find that woman. He knew only her first name, Evelyn, no last name, no official title, no government agency that would admit to knowing her. She appeared like an angel, and vanished the same way. The advisor with the graying temples stepped forward again. "Sir, if I may, my own family was among those saved that day, the Al-Mahmoud family." I remembered them instantly. The elderly patriarch who refused to leave without his books, the pregnant daughter-in-law who went into labor during the evacuation. We delivered that baby in the back of a relief truck while shells exploded 3 streets away. "Ahmad al-Mahmoud," I said quietly. The man's eyes widened. "You remember my father's name?" he whispered. Of course I remembered. You don't forget the names of people whose lives hang on the edge of your decisions. Even 30 years later, I could still feel the weight of that newborn in my arms, the way his grandmother's face crumpled in relief when we finally crossed into the safe zone. At last, Zaid found her voice, though it emerged as a thin, shaky whisper. "Mom, I don't understand. You worked at Memorial Hospital. You were a nurse. You told me you were just a nurse." I turned to look at my daughter, really look at her, for the first time in years. Not as the successful businesswoman she had become, not as the child I had raised, but as a woman trying to reconcile 2 completely different versions of reality. "I was a nurse," I said gently. That part was true. But it wasn't the only truth. Sheikh Hassan stepped closer, his voice lowering to something more private, as if what came next was meant first for me and only then for everyone else. "Miss Morrison, may I ask why you disappeared after the evacuations?" Hassan's advisor asked. "After saving so many families, you vanished from the diplomatic world entirely. We heard rumors that you had died, that you'd been reassigned, that intelligence agencies recruited you, but no one ever knew." The truth was both simpler and more complicated than any of those stories. I hadn't vanished because of some secret mission or hidden scandal. I disappeared because I fell in love, because I got pregnant, because I chose to build a life instead of continuing to save lives in the way I'd been trained to do. "I got married," I said plainly, "had a baby, and decided my family needed me more than the State Department did." That was the short version, stripped of its messier parts. I didn't mention how my husband, David, had grown increasingly uneasy with my long absences, the calls at all hours, the sudden trips for consulting work I couldn't explain. I didn't say how, when Zaid was 2, he'd given me an ultimatum: choose your career or choose your family. I chose my family. And when David died in a car accident 8 years later, leaving me to raise Zaid on my own, I never looked back. The State Department tried to pull me back in, consulting contracts, advisory roles, chances to return to the world I had once loved. But Zaid needed stability. She needed a mother who showed up to parent-teacher conferences, who was there for school plays, soccer matches, and teenage heartbreaks. So I became a hospital nurse, working night shifts so I could be present during the day. I buried my languages, my contacts, my years of experience in foreign affairs. I became exactly what Zaid believed I had always been, just mom. "You gave up everything," Ahmad al-Mahmoud murmured, awe in his voice. "A career that could have changed the world." Before I could answer, the conference room door opened and 3 more men walked in. I recognized the type immediately. Former military, now in business. Their posture, the way their eyes swept the room before settling on the key players, it was all familiar. Sheikh Hassan straightened slightly, slipping effortlessly from personal emotion back into professional composure. "Gentlemen, perfect timing," he said. "I'd like you to meet someone very special." They approached, and that old spark of recognition stirred inside me. The instinct for reading people, for sensing power, for predicting how a conversation would unfold. These were not just additional investors. These were men accustomed to making decisions that shaped entire regions. "This is Evelyn Morrison," Hassan announced, and there was a reverence in his tone that made Zaid visibly flinch. "The woman who saved my family 30 years ago. The woman who saved many of our families." The tallest of the three stepped forward. His accent was different. Lebanese, if my ear hadn't grown too rusty. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Khalil Rashid. My sister Amira speaks of you often." Amira. I felt the name like a chord struck deep inside me. The 12-year-old girl who'd been separated from her family in the chaos. The one I'd found in a refugee camp 3 days later, traumatized and alone. I'd stayed with her family for 2 weeks, helping them push their immigration paperwork through, teaching Amira English phrases so she could communicate with aid workers. "How is Amira?" I asked. Tears immediately gathered in his eyes. "She's Dr. Amira Rashid now, chief of pediatric surgery at the American University of Beirut. She named her daughter Evelyn." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. In all my years of quiet obscurity, I had often wondered about the families we'd pulled from the fire, about the children who'd grown up far from the chaos that had almost consumed them. But I had never once imagined that my name was still being spoken, that it had been passed down to a new generation. Zaid made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. When I looked at her, I saw that her perfectly applied mascara was beginning to smudge. "How many?" she whispered. "How many families?" Hassan exchanged a glance with the men beside him. "In Damascus alone, 47 families," he said. 312 people. But Damascus was not the only operation. Another silence settled over the room, but this one felt different. Not stunned, not confused, reverent. My mind flicked back through years I'd tried to seal off. Other cities, other crises, other faces. Sievo in 1994. Rwanda later that same year. A seemingly endless series of places where politics and hatred had turned ordinary lives into battlegrounds, and where, sometimes, if you knew the right people and asked the right questions, you could carve out a small pocket of safety in the middle of all that chaos. "Mrs. Morrison," said the third newcomer, speaking for the first time, "I represent a consortium of families whose lives you touched during those years. We have been hoping to find you for a very long time." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "For what purpose?" I asked. "To thank you, of course," he replied, "and to offer you something that should have been offered 30 years ago." I heard Zaid draw in a sharp breath. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her eyes widen as she finally realized this conversation was heading somewhere she had never anticipated. The woman she had dragged here as a symbolic family prop was about to become the center of the room. Hassan reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, high-quality envelope. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "we would be honored if you would consider a position with the Al-Rashid Foundation. We specialize in refugee resettlement, crisis intervention, and international humanitarian coordination." The irony was impossible to ignore. My daughter was here begging for $20 million in funding for her tech consulting firm, while these same investors were about to hand her useless old mother an opportunity to step back into the world she had walked away from. "What kind of position?" I asked, though a part of me already knew. "Director of Crisis Operations," Hassan replied. "Full autonomy, an unlimited budget for humanitarian projects, and a salary that reflects the true value of your experience." He passed me the envelope. "All the details are inside," he said, "but I can tell you this much. The annual compensation is $2.5 million, plus housing, travel, and a full support staff. The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Zaid was staring at it as if it were about to explode. I lifted my eyes to the men around me. Some I remembered as frightened children clinging to their parents in the dark, others who had grown up only with stories about the woman who helped their families escape chaos. Now they were offering me a chance to step back into the life I had once lived, to use the skills I'd deliberately buried and make a difference in the world again. But first, I had to deal with my daughter, whose entire understanding of who I was had just been shattered in the span of 20 minutes. The envelope lay on the conference table between us like a piece of evidence in a trial I hadn't realized I was on trial for. Zaid's gaze kept bouncing from it, to me, to the men who were treating me with the kind of respect usually reserved for heads of state or spiritual leaders. I need to sit down, Zaid said suddenly, her voice flat and hollow. She reached for one of the leather chairs, her legs unsteady. Sheikh Hassan immediately signaled to one of his assistants, who stepped forward and poured a glass of water from the crystal pitcher on the side table. "Of course," Hassan said. "Please, make yourself comfortable. This must be quite overwhelming." Overwhelming. That was one way to describe it. I watched my daughter accept the water with shaking hands, and a familiar ache stirred in my chest, the same ache I'd carried for 30 years, wondering if I'd done the right thing when I walked away from my career to be the mother she needed. "Mrs. Morrison," said Khalil Rashid, his tone gentle but insistent, "perhaps you could tell us what happened after Damascus. We lost all trace of you." I remained standing, partly out of old habit. In diplomatic circles, you never sat unless invited, and you certainly never sat first, and partly because this moment felt too significant to handle while casually seated at a conference table. "I went home," I said, "to Washington, D.C. My daughter was 2 years old, my husband was threatening divorce, and I realized I couldn't save every family in the world if I couldn't save my own." The truth, of course, was messier than that. It always was. David had given me his ultimatum during one of my rare returns from what my files called humanitarian consulting. He stood in our kitchen, holding Zaid in his arms, and said words that still echoed in my mind. "Choose, Evelyn. Choose us or choose them, but you can't choose both anymore." "Your husband," Ahmad al-Mahmoud said carefully, "he did not support your work?" I glanced at Zaid, who was listening with the intense focus of someone finally hearing a foreign language translated into words they could understand. "David was a good man," I said, "and that was true. But he married a nurse, not a diplomat. When the State Department started sending me on increasingly dangerous assignments, when I began disappearing for months at a time, he felt like he was losing his wife to a world he couldn't be part of. What I didn't say was that David had found my emergency passport hidden in our bedroom, along with documents under 3 different names. That he had confronted me about the scars on my back, the ones I'd told him were from a childhood accident, but that actually came from a kidnapping in Somalia that went very wrong. That piece by piece he realized the woman he'd married was not the woman climbing into bed beside him at night. "So, you left the diplomatic service," Sheikh Hassan said, and I could hear the unspoken question beneath his words. "I was never officially in the diplomatic service," I replied. "On paper, I was a civilian contractor. Humanitarian aid coordination." I gave a small, wry smile. "But yes, I walked away from all of it." The fourth man, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Mrs. Morrison, my name is Omar Al-Zahra. I'm here on behalf of the families from the Sievo evacuations of 1994. My breath caught. Sievo had been different from Damascus. In Damascus, we'd raced against the clock with at least some level of official backing. In Sievo, we had worked entirely outside normal channels, relying on networks that lived in the gray space between diplomacy and what many would call espionage. "The Al-Zahra family," I said slowly, remembering. "Your father was the university professor." "Yes," he said, "and my mother was pregnant with me when you helped them escape the siege." I felt the old weight of those memories settle onto my shoulders again. Sievo in 1994 had been a nightmare of sniper fire and artillery shells. The family had been trapped in the university district for 8 months, surviving on UN rations and whatever food could be smuggled through underground tunnels. "You carried me out yourself," Omar continued. "When my mother went into premature labor during the evacuation, you chose to stay with her instead of leading the other families to safety." Zaid's water glass slipped from her hand and rattled loudly against the table. "You were in war zones?" she whispered. "While I was a baby, you were in war zones?" The question hit me like a physical blow. This was what I had always feared, the very reason I had buried those years so deeply. The guilt of knowing that while I was crawling through bombed-out buildings to save strangers, my own daughter was being tucked into bed by babysitters and daycare workers. "Sometimes," I said quietly, "when there was no other choice." "No other choice?" Zaid's voice rose, sharp with rage and hurt. I could see 3 decades of unspoken resentment hardening into something sharper, more dangerous. "You had a choice. You had a daughter. You chose strangers over your own child." Her accusation hung in the air like a slap. Around us, the Middle Eastern businessmen shifted in their seats, clearly aware they had stepped straight into the middle of a family wound far deeper than they expected. Sheikh Hassan cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps we should give you both some privacy to—" "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "If we're going to do this, we do it now. All of it." I turned fully to face Zaid, seeing her with new clarity, not as the polished, successful woman who seemed to have outgrown me, but as the little girl who once asked why Mommy was always working, why Mommy sometimes came home bruised, why Mommy cried in the bathroom when she thought no one could hear. "You're right," I said. "I made choices that took me away from you. But you need to understand why." I reached into my purse and took out something I'd carried with me for 30 years, but had never shown her. A small photograph, its edges worn soft from being handled so many times. It showed a group of children, maybe 20, standing in front of a refugee camp tent, all of them smiling shyly at the camera. They were holding a banner that said in Arabic, "Thank you, Miss Evelyn." "This was taken in 1993, I said, handing the photo to Zaid. 3 months after Damascus. Those children are all alive today because of what we did. They have families now, careers, lives that simply wouldn't exist if we'd left them behind." Zaid stared at the picture, and I saw her hands start to shake again. "Hassan was the little boy in the front row," I added quietly. "The one holding the banner. He was 7. He'd been separated from his parents for 6 weeks. When we finally found them, he hadn't spoken a single word since the separation. The doctors said it was post-traumatic stress. They weren't sure he would ever recover." Sheikh Hassan stepped closer, his voice rough with emotion. "She spent 3 hours a day with me for 2 weeks, he said, teaching me English words, helping me understand that my parents were safe. The first word I spoke after the trauma was her name, Evelyn." Tears shimmered in Zaid's eyes, but her jaw stayed locked in stubborn anger. "That's very moving," she said, her tone hard and brittle. "But it doesn't change the fact that you chose them over me." "Every time I chose them, it was because you were safe," I replied. "You had a home, food, medical care, and a father who loved you. Those children had nothing except the hope that someone, somewhere, would care enough to risk everything for them." Omar Al-Zahra stepped forward, his voice gentle but unyielding. "Miss Morrison, I don't think you fully grasp the scale of what your mother did," he told Zaid. "The Sievo operation alone saved more than 200 people, and that was just one mission." He gestured to the others around him. "Between 1990 and 1996, your mother coordinated evacuations in 8 different countries. She is personally responsible for saving over 1,500 lives." The number landed like a punch. I watched the color drain from Zaid's face as she tried to process it. 1,500 people, she repeated numbly. 1,500 people who went on to have children of their own, Ahmad al-Mahmoud added. People who built businesses became doctors, teachers, engineers, people who strengthened their new communities in ways that will ripple forward for generations. Khalil pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like a long contact list. "Would you like to see what some of those children grew up to be?" he asked. "There's Dr. Amamira Rashid, as I mentioned, but also Professor Hassan Al-Mahmoud at Georgetown University, engineer Layla Qassam, who designed water purification systems now used across the Middle East, architect Samir Qasemi, whose refugee housing designs have been implemented by the UN." He lifted his head and met Zaid's gaze. "Your mother didn't just save lives," he said softly. "She saved possibilities, futures, entire family lines that would never have existed without her." I watched my daughter struggle under the weight of all this. She was trying to reconcile the mother she'd always known with the woman being described in this room, the mom who worked nights at the hospital to pay for her private school, and the operative trusted to coordinate international crisis evacuations most people would never even hear about. "Why didn't you tell me?" Zaid finally asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you let me think you were just ordinary?" It was the question I'd been bracing for over 3 decades, the one I had prayed would never come, because I had never been sure I had a good enough answer. "Because I wanted you to be proud of me for being your mother," I said quietly. "Not for things I did before you were born. I wanted you to love me for who I was with you, not for who I had been without you." Sheikh Hassan stepped forward again, his expression turning grave. "Mrs. Morrison, there is something else you should know," he said. "Something we discovered only recently, while researching your background." A cold, familiar dread slid through me. There were parts of my past I had hoped would stay buried forever. "The State Department files from your final assignment," Hassan continued carefully. "They were declassified last year under the 30-year rule. We learned that your decision to leave diplomatic work was not entirely voluntary." Zaid's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face suddenly sharp with focus. "What does that mean?" she demanded. Hassan looked at me, silently asking permission. I nodded slowly. We were far past the point of turning back now. "Your mother's final assignment was Somalia in 1996, he said. "She was captured by militants while attempting to evacuate a group of aid workers. She was held for 17 days and tortured." The word landed in the room like an explosion. "When she was rescued," Hassan went on, "the State Department offered her full medical support, psychological treatment, and a promotion to Deputy Director of Crisis Operations. She refused everything and disappeared from their records." I felt Zaid's eyes on me like a spotlight, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. Those 17 days in Somalia were a locked room in my mind, one I had never opened for anyone, not even David. "You were tortured," Zaid whispered, "and then you came home and made me breakfast and helped me with my homework." "You were 3 years old," I said, my voice little more than a breath. "You didn't need to know that monsters were real." The conference room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Zaid's quiet sobs. 30 years of resentment and misconception were disintegrating in front of us, leaving behind something raw and painful. But for the first time, honest. "Oh God," Zaid choked out through her tears. "What kind of daughter have I been?" The silence that followed her question felt almost sacred, like stepping into a cathedral thick with confession and forgiveness. I watched my daughter crumble in her chair, the polished, confident professional completely stripped away by the truth of who her mother really was, or rather, who I had once been. "What kind of daughter have I been?" she repeated, barely more than a breath. "I called you useless in front of men whose families you saved. I was ashamed of you." I moved toward her on instinct, the way I used to when she was small and woke up shaking from a nightmare. But she lifted her hand, stopping me. "No," she said sharply, swiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Don't you dare comfort me right now. I don't deserve it." Sheikh Hassan cleared his throat softly. "Perhaps we should postpone our discussion for another time." "No," Zaid said, straightening in her chair with the stubborn resolve I recognized all too well, my own stubbornness reflected back at me. I want to hear all of it, everything. She looked around at the men gathered there, these powerful businessmen who had rearranged their schedules to honor a woman they considered a hero. Tell me about Somalia, she said. Tell me what my mother went through while I was playing with dolls and complaining that she worked too much. Omar Alzara glanced at me, clearly unsure. Mrs. Morrison, this is very personal information. Tell her, I said quietly. All of it. If we were finally opening this door, it had to stay open. No more half-truths, no more shielding her from things I thought were too ugly to share. Zaid was 38 years old. It was time she knew who her mother really was. Omar nodded. The operation in Somalia was supposed to be a straightforward evacuation, he began. A group of Doctors Without Borders staff had been caught in the crossfire between government forces and rebels. Your mother was sent in with a small team to extract them. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But the intelligence was wrong. The rebels weren't looking for ransom or negotiations. They wanted to make a statement about Western interference in African conflicts. The medical team and your mother's extraction team were captured on the second day. The familiar tightness gripped my chest. Even 3 decades later, even after years of therapy, meditation, and deliberate forgetting, Somalia was still the darkest shadow in my past. The official reports were heavily redacted, Ahmad al-Mahmoud added, but through family connections, some of us have relatives in intelligence, we learned more. Mrs. Morrison was tortured for information on American operations in the region. When she refused to cooperate, they shifted their goal. They wanted to break her spirit, to prove that American operatives were not as strong as they claimed. Zaid's face had gone completely white. How long? She whispered. 17 days, I answered before anyone else could. 17 days and 16 nights. And you never told me? Her voice cracked. You never told anyone. I never told anyone, I said. What would have been the point? What good would it have done to tell you, except to give you nightmares about things you couldn't change or control? Khalil leaned forward, his expression darkening. Mrs. Morrison, there is something else about Somalia you may not know, he said. Something we learned while investigating. My stomach dropped. There were parts of that mission the State Department had buried so deeply that even I had only fragments of the full picture. The medical team you were trying to extract, Khalil continued carefully. They included my cousin, Dr. Fatima Rashid. She was working with Doctors Without Borders, performing surgeries on civilians caught in the fighting. Her name hit me like a physical blow. Fatima, the young surgeon who worked 18-hour days in conditions that would have broken physicians in the best-equipped hospitals, brilliant, fierce, refusing to abandon the wounded even as the situation became hopelessly dangerous. Fatima didn't survive, I said, the words rough and bitter on my tongue. No, Khalil agreed softly. She was executed on the 14th day of your captivity, shot in the head while you were forced to watch. Zaid let out a strangled sound. They made you watch? The memory surged back with brutal clarity. Fatima's last words to me, tell my family I saved 12 children today. The crack of the gunshot, the way her body dropped limp and empty, like a discarded puppet. They wanted to break me, I said, my voice flat, almost mechanical. When the physical torture didn't work, they turned to psychological warfare. They believed that if I watched innocent people die because of my mission, I'd eventually give them what they wanted. But you didn't break, Omar said quietly, his tone full of respect. Everyone breaks eventually, I replied. I was close, very close. If the rescue team had come a day or two later, I probably would have told them everything. Sheikh Hassan stepped closer, his gaze intent. Mrs. Morrison, the rescue operation that saved you, do you know how it was organized? I shook my head. I was unconscious when they pulled me out, I said. Severe dehydration, broken ribs, infected wounds. I spent 3 weeks in a military hospital in Germany before I was even stable enough to be debriefed. The rescue wasn't a government operation, Hassan said carefully. It was organized and funded by the families you'd saved in your earlier missions, Hassan said. When the State Department failed to negotiate your release, we took matters into our own hands. The revelation hit me like a lightning strike. You paid for mercenaries? I asked. We paid for the best extraction team money could buy, Ahmad al-Mahmoud corrected gently. $2.7 million, pooled from 43 families whose lives you had saved. We were not going to let you die in that hellhole after everything you'd done for us. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I dropped heavily into one of the leather chairs. For all these years, I had believed my rescue was just another routine military operation. I had never known that the people I once pulled out of danger had literally bought my freedom. Zaid was staring at them, and at me, with an expression I couldn't read. You organized a private military operation to save my mother? She asked. Of course, said Sheikh Hassan, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She risked her life for our families. How could we do any less for her? And after all that, Zaid said, her voice hollow. She came home and worked night shifts as a nurse so she could take care of me during the day. The words hung between us like an accusation, but this time the accusation wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at herself. Your mother never told you about her injuries from Somalia, did she? Omar asked softly. Zaid shook her head, staring at me as if she were seeing my body for the first time. Permanent nerve damage in her left hand, Omar continued. 3 fractured vertebrae in her lower back that never healed properly. Chronic pain that she managed with physical therapy and meditation, because she refused strong painkillers while she was raising you. I watched Zaid's face crumple as memories surfaced, the times she'd seen me rubbing my back, flexing my fingers, brushing it off as just getting older. The scars on your arms, she whispered. The ones you said were from accidents when you were young. Cigarette burns, I said quietly. They wanted information about American safe houses in Mogadishu. Zaid doubled over, as if the air had been punched out of her. And I complained that you worked too much, she choked. I resented you for missing school plays and soccer games. I was embarrassed by your car, your clothes, the apartment we moved into after Dad died. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. You could have had money, status, important work. You could have been somebody. I was somebody, I answered firmly. I was your mother. That mattered more to me than anything else I had ever done or ever could do. Sheikh Hassan stepped forward again, holding out the envelope he had offered earlier. Mrs. Morrison, he said, perhaps now you understand why this offer is so important to us. We're not just offering you a job, we're offering you a chance to reclaim the life you sacrificed for your family. I looked at the envelope, then at Zaid, who was watching me with a complicated, unreadable expression. The position comes with full autonomy, Hassan continued. You would report only to our board of directors, every one of them a member of a family you helped save. Your decisions would be final. Your budget would be effectively unlimited. You'd have the resources to carry out the kind of humanitarian operations that governments are too slow or too political to manage. We've already identified 17 current crisis zones where your expertise could have an immediate impact, Ahmad added. Syrian refugees in Turkey, Rohingya in Bangladesh, political dissidents in Myanmar. The work you did 30 years ago is needed now more than ever. I felt something stirring deep inside me, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in decades. The old fire, the sense of purpose that had once driven me through war zones and political minefields. That feeling of being exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. But layered over that fire was the weight of Zaid's gaze. 38 years of a complicated, tangled mother-daughter relationship. The knowledge that if I accepted this offer, I would in a way be confirming what she had always sensed, that a part of me belonged to a world larger than just the two of us. What about your consulting business? I asked her, nodding toward the charts still glowing on the screen. This meeting was supposed to be about your funding. Zaid let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. My business, she said bitterly. My brilliant technological solutions for emerging markets. She swept her hand toward the men around us. These men just offered my mother more money in a year than I make in 5. They came here to invest $20 million in a tech startup, and instead they found a legend they've been searching for since I was 13. She stood up so quickly the chair rocked behind her, and for a moment she swayed. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I brought you here as window dressing. Family values," I said. "Let them see we're respectable people with strong family ties." She laughed again, raw and sharp. "I dragged you into this meeting as a prop, and it turns out you're the most important person in the room." Hassan looked uncomfortable. "Miss Morrison, perhaps we should—" "There's nothing to discuss," Zaid cut in. "My company is built on algorithms and market analysis, but my mother built her career on saving actual human lives. There is no comparison." She grabbed her purse and coat from the chair. "Take the job, Mom," she said. "Take all of it. The money, the position, the chance to go back to being who you really are." She paused at the door and turned back, her eyes red but clear. "I'm sorry I never really saw you," she said. "I'm sorry I was ashamed of you. And I'm sorry it took strangers to show me what an incredible woman my mother is." Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. I was left standing in the center of the conference room, holding an envelope that contained the possibility of reclaiming everything I'd given up 3 decades ago, surrounded by 4 of the most powerful men in the Middle East. The silence that followed felt like the hush after an explosion. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched out in every direction, millions of people going about their ordinary lives, completely unaware that, in this room, my entire world had just been turned upside down. "Perhaps we should give you some time to process," Sheikh Hassan said gently. But I could see the worry in his eyes. He had come here expecting to make a generous offer to a woman he admired from afar, and instead, in the process, he'd exposed fault lines that had been hidden in my relationship with my daughter for decades. "No," I replied, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. "I think I've had enough time. 30 years, to be exact." I opened the envelope and slid the papers out. The offer was even more extensive than he'd described. Not just a salary of $2.5 million a year, but housing support, travel budgets, security, complete medical coverage, and a discretionary emergency fund with no ceiling at all. More than the money, it was the structure that took my breath away. It was everything I'd dreamed of back in my State Department days. No suffocating bureaucracy, no political agendas, no committees miles away overriding decisions on the ground, just the authority and resources to identify crises and move fast, backed by some of the wealthiest families in the world. "The Al-Rashid Foundation," I read aloud from the letterhead. "Named after my family," Hassan said, "but bankrolled by all of us. We founded it 5 years ago for one purpose: to find you and offer you this role. When we failed to locate you, we started the work anyway, always hoping that one day we could convince you to lead it properly." Ahmad walked to the screen and switched the slides. "These are our current operations," he said. "Refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon, medical clinics in Afghanistan, education programs for displaced children across the region, but we don't have the expertise to expand into real crisis intervention." I studied the charts and figures. What they had built was impressive, but I could immediately see the gaps. They were strong at providing relief after disaster, less so at preventing disaster or managing the delicate diplomacy that could stop situations from exploding in the first place. "How many full-time staff do you have?" I asked, slipping automatically back into my old analytical mode. 347, Khalil replied. "Across 12 countries, plus about 800 contractors and local partners. Our operational budget is roughly $120 million a year, but as you'll see in the offer letter, we're ready to scale that up substantially if you accept." A familiar thrill moved through me, the exhilaration of staring down a complex operational challenge. This wasn't just a position, it was a chance to build the sort of humanitarian machine that could truly change outcomes on a global level. And yet, even as that fire reignited in me, I couldn't stop seeing Zaid walking out of the room, her posture defeated, her world upside down, realizing that everything she thought she knew about us had been incomplete. "What about my daughter?" I blurted before I could stop myself. Omar frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "Zaid," I clarified. "Her company. She came here looking for funding, and instead she found out her mother is apparently more interesting to you than she is. What happens to her now?" They exchanged looks, and I could tell they hadn't fully considered that part. "Mrs. Morrison," Hassan said cautiously, "we would of course be willing to discuss investment opportunities with your daughter as well, but her tech consulting firm isn't what you're actually interested in." I finished for him. "You're here for oil and gas projects, infrastructure, defense, regional development. Zaid's company is too small, too niche, too American for your portfolios." Their silence confirmed it. Zaid had been chasing doors that were never going to open for her, not in the way she imagined. She'd been trying to force her way into markets controlled by people who had the kind of connections she couldn't even begin to match. "However," Khalil said slowly, "if she were open to redirecting her technological expertise toward humanitarian applications—" A spark flared inside me. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Crisis communication systems, refugee registration and tracking, algorithms for allocating resources in real time," he explained, "the kind of infrastructure that could transform the way aid is delivered." He nodded toward the screen. "Your daughter's experience with data and emerging markets could be exactly what we need to modernize our operations," he said. "We've been struggling with information management," Ahmad added. "When a crisis breaks, we lose crucial hours just trying to coordinate between agencies and governments. A robust technological solution could save hundreds of lives in the first 48 hours alone." I looked down at the documents again, then back at the men who had spent 5 years and a small fortune searching for me. They were offering everything I had ever wanted professionally. But wrapped inside that offer was something I never expected, a way to bring Zaid into this world with me, not as the overlooked daughter of a legend, but as a partner, an architect of something new. "I need to talk to her first," I said at last. "Before I can accept anything, my daughter and I need to understand each other." Hassan nodded immediately. "Of course. Family comes first. We learned that from you 30 years ago." I gathered my purse and coat, tucking the envelope securely inside. "Give me 24 hours, I said. "I'll have an answer for you tomorrow." As I started toward the door, Omar called after me. "Mrs. Morrison, your daughter was wrong about one thing." I turned. "What's that?" "She said she brought you as window dressing, but we only agreed to this meeting because we heard that a woman named Zaid Morrison was the daughter of someone named Evelyn. We've been tracking your family for years, hoping for exactly this." I froze. "You mean my daughter didn't pick you as investors?" Hassan gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "We chose her because she was yours," he said. The elevator ride down to the underground parking felt endless. My thoughts spun in circles, about the offer, the foundation, the lives that could be saved. But beneath the rush of possibility there ran a deeper undercurrent, guilt, regret, and a single question that wouldn't let me go. After everything I had done for strangers, what had I really done for my own child? For 30 years, I'd tried to shield Zaid from the truth about my past, convinced she was better off not knowing about the violence and danger that had shaped my early career. But by protecting her from that reality, I had also kept her from understanding the reasons behind my choices. Why I worked nights so I could be present during her school days. Why I insisted on living modestly despite having connections that could have opened doors to wealth and influence. Why I sometimes drifted away into myself, lost in memories she could never quite reach. My phone buzzed just as I reached my car. A text from Zaid. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. You deserved better from me." I stared at the words for a long moment before replying. "You deserved better from me too. Can we talk?" Her answer came almost instantly. "I'm at home. Please come over." The drive to her apartment in the Marina District took about 45 minutes in heavy afternoon traffic, just long enough for my nerves to fray and my thoughts to tangle. How do you compress 3 decades of decisions into a conversation with someone who has only just realized that her entire understanding of your relationship was incomplete? Her building was one of those renovated warehouses turned luxury lofts, exposed brick, designer lighting, minimalist art. I'd always felt slightly out of place there, as though I were a visitor in a glossy magazine spread rather than my daughter's home. Today, riding the elevator up, I wondered if that sense of not belonging had less to do with the decor and more to do with feeling like an outsider in the life she had built. She opened the door before I could knock. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, but her expression was resolute. "I've been thinking," she said immediately, skipping any small talk, "about everything they said, about what you gave up to raise me, about how selfish I've been." I followed her into the living room, taking in the expensive furniture, the original paintings, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. This was the sort of life I had wanted for her, safe, comfortable, secure. But looking at it now, I wondered how much of that safety had come at the cost of loneliness. "You weren't selfish," I said, sitting down on her pristine white leather couch. "You were just working with incomplete information." She sat opposite me, hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Why didn't you tell me about Somalia?" she asked. "About the torture? About the families you saved? Did you think I couldn't handle it?" The question I'd dreaded and expected. "I thought you deserved a normal childhood," I said slowly. "A childhood where you could believe the world was basically safe, where monsters only existed in stories, where your mother was just an ordinary woman who loved you more than anything." "But I didn't think the world was safe," Zaid said, her voice cracking. "I thought you didn't love me enough to put me first. I thought you worked nights because you were avoiding me, that we lived modestly because you didn't care enough to try for something better." The words hit like body blows. All those years I'd believed I was protecting her, and she'd interpreted my choices as evidence of indifference. "I loved you so much I gave up everything else," I whispered. "My career, my identity, my sense of purpose. I reinvented myself because I thought that's what you needed." Tears spilled down her cheeks again. "And I became someone who was ashamed of the woman who sacrificed everything for me," she said. "God, Mom, what kind of monster does that make me?" I moved to sit beside her and wrapped my arms around her, the way I used to when she was small and the world seemed too big and terrifying. "It makes you human," I murmured into her hair. "It makes you my daughter. And I love you exactly as you are, all your complicated feelings included." We stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other while 30 years of misunderstanding slowly began to unravel. Eventually, Zaid pulled back and searched my face. "Are you going to take the job?" she asked. I thought of the envelope in my purse, of Hassan's offer, of the chance to return to work that mattered on a global scale. "I don't know," I said honestly. "It would mean traveling again, being away sometimes, going back into a world you've never really been part of." Zaid was quiet for a moment. Then, to my surprise, she gave me a small, almost shy smile. "Actually," she said, "I think I might be part of it after all." 6 months later, I stood in the main operations center of the Al Rashid Foundation's headquarters in Geneva, facing a wall of screens showing crisis zones across 3 continents. In just half a year, we had evacuated 237 aid workers from a civil war in Sudan, set up emergency medical clinics for earthquake survivors in Turkey, and coordinated food distributions for more than 50,000 refugees displaced by flooding in Bangladesh. But today's mission was different. Today was personal. "Mom, we have confirmation from the field team in Myanmar." Zaid's voice came through my headset. Steady, focused, professional. "The extraction vehicles are in position," she continued, "and the diplomatic channels you opened are still holding. We're green lit for the rescue." I glanced across the operations center to where she sat at her station, surrounded by monitors, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards as she synced real-time intel from a dozen sources. In 6 months, she had gone from a struggling tech consultant to one of the most capable crisis communication specialists I'd ever worked with. "Copy that," I said into my headset. "Tell the field team they are cleared to proceed, and Zaid—" "Yes?" "Excellent work." I caught the quick flash of a smile on her face before she turned back to her screens. Our relationship had transformed into something I never thought possible. We weren't just mother and daughter carrying the weight of misread sacrifices anymore. We were partners, colleagues, equals in work that mattered more than either of us had dared to imagine. The Myanmar operation was our most ambitious project yet, evacuating a group of political dissidents and their families, all marked for execution by the military regime. It was exactly the kind of mission I'd run decades ago, but this time I had proper resources, institutional backing, and most importantly, my daughter working at my side. "Mrs. Morrison," came Ahmad al-Mahmoud's voice from the conference area, where the board was overseeing the mission. "The Lebanese government has confirmed their airfield is ready to receive our transport planes. Your diplomatic contacts performed flawlessly." I nodded, eyes fixed on the live feed from Myanmar. 3 years earlier, these dissidents would have been abandoned by official channels, left to face prison or death, because rescuing them was too politically inconvenient. The Al-Rashid Foundation didn't answer to governments, and that made all the difference. We could move where diplomats couldn't, act faster than any ministry, and step in long before political debates finished chewing on human lives. "Transport 1 is airborne," Zaid reported. 18 passengers on board, including 7 children. ETA to Beirut is 4 hours, 23 minutes. A cheer rippled through the operations room, but I felt the same familiar blend of relief and bone-deep fatigue that always followed a successful extraction. Another group of families would wake up tomorrow with a future simply because we were willing to act while others hesitated. My phone buzzed, a message from Hassan watching the mission unfold from Doha. "Following Myanmar from Qatar. Magnificent work, as always. Your children would be proud." I smiled. Lately, he'd taken to calling all the people we saved my parents or children. A quiet reminder that every name on our lists belonged to someone who loved them the way his family had loved him when I pulled them out of Damascus 3 decades ago. "Mom?" Zaid's voice came through my headset again, but this time there was a different note in it, curiosity layered with concern. "Can you come here a second?" I walked over to her workstation. A crease of concentration cut across her forehead as she studied one of her screens. "What is it?" I asked. "I've been reviewing the intel streams from our recent missions," she said, pointing at a dense data visualization. "Somalia, Myanmar, Sudan, the earthquake in Turkey. There's a pattern, and I don't think it's coincidence." I leaned in, letting my eyes adjust to the web of lines and nodes she'd built. "What kind of pattern?" "Information sources," she said. "The intel that led us to these crises didn't come through normal channels. Someone has been feeding us extremely precise information about situations that need intervention. Someone with access to very high-level intelligence across multiple governments." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "Show me." Zaid brought up a series of communication logs, highlighting timestamps and origin markers. "Look at the timing," she said. "In every case, we received actionable intel 24 to 48 hours before any official agency reacted. The only way that happens is if someone with extraordinary access is deliberately steering our operations." I stared at the glowing lines and nodes, recognizing a familiar structure I'd hoped never to see again. "Have you identified the source?" I asked. "Not directly," she replied. "But the data routes come through at least 6 different cover identities. They're sophisticated, easily on par with state intelligence services." Before I could respond, my phone rang. An unknown number with a country code I knew all too well. Somalia. "This is Evelyn," I answered, keeping my voice guarded. "Hello, Evelyn. It's been a long time." The voice turned my blood to ice. Colonel Marcus Webb, my former handler at the State Department, the man who'd sent me into Somalia with bad intel and whose failure had cost me 17 days of captivity and torture. Marcus, I said, aware that the entire operations center had fallen silent, eyes on me. What an unexpected surprise. I need to see you, he said. There are things about your current work you need to understand. I'm listening. Not on the phone. Can you meet me in Prague tomorrow? Diplomat Hotel, 2 p.m. I felt Zaid's hand wrap around my forearm. She couldn't hear him, but she didn't need to. My body had already betrayed the past. Why Prague? I asked. Neutral ground, and because what I have to tell you affects your foundation's operations in ways you haven't realized. The line went dead. I stood there holding the phone, feeling 30 years of carefully buried fear claw their way back up from the dark. Mom? Zaid's voice was low, urgent. Who was that? I looked around the room, at the live feeds, at our staff, at my daughter in a headset and crisis vest, utterly woven into this life with me. Someone from my past, I said, someone I never planned to hear from again. 24 hours later, I sat in the ornate lobby of the Diplomat Hotel in Prague, watching travelers drift across the marble floors, while I waited for a conversation that might rewrite everything I thought I knew about this new chapter of my life. Marcus arrived exactly at 2. Older, grayer, but still carrying that rigid military posture that once made him one of the most respected intelligence officers in the State Department. His hair was completely silver now, his face heavily lined, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Evelyn, he said, sliding into the chair opposite me. You look good. Humanitarian work suits you. Let's skip the small talk, Marcus. Why am I here? He gave the small, controlled smile I remembered, the smile of a man who always knows more than he's saying. Your foundation has been very effective at spotting crises before they hit the public radar, he said. Impressively effective at acquiring exactly the intel you need to launch rescues. He tilted his head. One might think you had access to classified information. My pulse kicked up, but I kept my face still. The Al-Rashid Foundation has strong sources, I replied. When you save lives, people remember. They reach out when others are in danger. Exactly, he said. And some of those people now work in intelligence across the Middle East and Europe. People whose families you saved 30 years ago. People who've spent their careers in positions where they could one day repay the debt. The implication hit hard. You're saying our intel is coming from former refugees, I said slowly. Their children, their relatives, people who built careers in government because of what we did. Marcus leaned forward. Evelyn, you didn't just save lives back then. You created a web of loyalty and gratitude that spans continents. You built a human intelligence network without even trying. I thought of Hassan, of the others who had found me, of their titles, their reach, their resources. What do you want, Marcus? I asked. I want to offer you something your foundation doesn't have, he said. Official support, legal cover, the ability to operate with full government backing when necessary. He took a folder from his briefcase, thick with classified stamps. The intelligence community has been watching you, he continued. You're doing what we used to do, only better, faster, without the political shackles. And we'd like to propose a partnership. Not control, a partnership. Access to official intelligence feeds, diplomatic protection for your teams, backup when missions go sideways. And in return? I asked. In return, he said, once in a while we'd ask for your help in situations where the U.S. can't be seen getting involved, off-the-books rescues, sensitive extractions. You'd still be saving lives, just occasionally in alignment with our strategic interests. I looked at the folder, feeling the old weight of impossible choices settle onto my shoulders again. So you want my foundation to become an unofficial arm of American intelligence? I said. I want you to be what you've always been, Marcus replied. Someone who steps in when the system fails, only this time with better intel and legal protection. I thought about Zaid, about the missions we'd already run, about the people still out there waiting for someone, anyone, to come for them. And I thought about the moral lines I'd already crossed in my past life, the ones I'd spent years trying to live beyond. "I need to discuss this with my team," I said. Marcus nodded and rose from his chair. "Of course," he said. "But remember, Evelyn, the world is more dangerous now than it was 30 years ago. The work you're doing is more important than ever. Don't let old wounds stop you from accepting help that could save thousands more." As I watched him walk away, I understood that my life had come full circle. I had been a quiet operative, then a single mother, then a nurse. Now I was back where I'd started, but this time the conditions were different. This time I wasn't alone in the dark. I had a daughter who knew exactly who I was and chose to stand beside me anyway. I had a foundation built on gratitude, not politics, and I had the chance to shape how this power would be used. I pulled out my phone and typed a short message. "Come to Prague. There's something we need to discuss about our future." Her reply appeared almost at once. "Already booking my flight. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." For the first time in 3 decades, I felt whole. I had reclaimed my purpose, rebuilt my relationship with my daughter, and helped create something that genuinely mattered on a global scale. And now, standing at the edge of yet another decision, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. The woman who had been humiliated in a conference room 6 months earlier, the useless old woman in a navy dress, no longer existed. In her place stood someone with the power to save lives, shield families, and influence events far beyond one room, one city, one country. With my daughter as my partner and the gratitude of nations at my back, I had finally grown into the person I was always meant to be. Now I'm curious about you, the one who stayed with me until the end of this story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever lived through something that forced you to see your parents or your children differently? Tell me in the comments below. And while you're here, I'm leaving 2 more of the channel's most powerful stories on screen. Give them a chance. They might surprise you even more than this one. Thank you for watching and for staying with me all the way to the end.